So how do we go about determining the lime requirement? We're going to talk about this in general here, and then we'll get into more details in a subsequent video. So there's several means by which you can determine a lime requirement. If you send a soil sample to a laboratory for them to determine it, and you ask them to do a titration, they can do it, but this is painstakingly slow. But what you do is you take a soil and you add a small amount of base and track the change in pH of that soil over time. So you might add calcium hydroxide to the soil, and it's adding OHs, which neutralizes the potential acidity, of course, active acidity as well. But you would track the change in pH over time. And so here's an example. Here's two different types of soils, soil series, I'm guessing. Here's pH and the amount, basically the amount of calcium carbonate or lime to add per acre furrow slice. And the curves tell you a story. It tells you, okay, here's the starting point of these soils in terms of pH. And if you add a little bit of base and titrate and measure pH over time when you perform this titration, these curves tell you basically how much lime to add to go from an initial pH to a final pH. This is labor intensive, it's soil specific, and hardly anybody does this anymore. So what else can you do to determine a lime requirement? You can use a buffer solution. This is what most laboratories do. If you were to try to do this in a laboratory on campus, you would follow the same principles. You add a buffer solution to the soil and allow it to sit there and equilibrate, and then measure the change in that solution pH after a known period of time. Okay. The more the pH drops, the more potential acidity is present, and thus the higher lime requirement is needed to raise the pH of that soil. So you add a buffer solution. The buffer solution resists change in pH, but it does change in terms of pH, and it changes because the buffer acidity in the soil is being released off the exchange sites and reacting with the buffer solution to change the buffer solution pH. There's many types of buffer solutions that are used. And in the United States, there's four that dominate. There's something called the Melick buffer. This is used in ultisols, so highly weathered soils, like in the southeastern part of the US. There's the Schumacher-McLean-Pratt, or SMP buffer. These are used primarily for alpha sols, but this buffer is used in Ohio, and it's actually used in other states as well. The state I used to live in and work in, Colorado, used the SMP buffer as a buffer pH. You also have the Adams-Evans buffer. It's used in kaolinitic soils. These are highly weathered soils. And then you have the Woodruff buffer, which is used in mollisols, like you find in the short and tall grass prairies of the US. But in Ohio, we use the SMP buffer. If you're interested in learning more about the SMP buffer, Google it, and it'll tell you how it works. But it's a buffer solution. And if you were to ask for buffer pH from a soil testing lab so you could determine a lime requirement, or if a soil testing lab was going to determine a lime requirement for you, this should be on a soil test report, and it's reported as either buffer pH or SMP buffer pH or SMP pH. Every lab does this a little bit differently. So how do you interpret the buffer results? Luckily, if you were to send your soil to a testing lab, they interpret it for you. You tell them a target pH, or they come up with a target pH, and you look at the results and say, well, this wasn't exactly what I wanted to target. Can you estimate my lime requirement based on this target pH? But they use something like this. They use algorithms that you see here. So these are curves, but these curves can be put into a computer program to interpret the SMP buffer with respect to how much lime is needed. And so here on the x-axis is the soil SMP buffer pH, wherever it lies. All right. Let's say it lies at, I don't know, 5.5. If you wanted to raise the pH of your soil to 6, you would go up from 5.5 vertically to the pink line, and it would tell you that you would need to add about 7,500 pounds of lime per acre furrow slice. If you wanted to target 6.5, a pH of 6.5, you'd need to add probably 16,000 pounds. And this is how this works, okay? But there's other ways to do this. So you can estimate the amount of lime that's needed using a very simple pH versus percent base saturation relationship, like you see in the picture in the top right-hand corner. And how do you come up with these numbers? Well, percent base saturation is simply the amount of calcium, magnesium, potassium, and sodium on cation exchange sites. So to determine this, you need to know the cation exchange capacity of a soil, and then you need to determine those 4 elements that are on the exchange sites to determine the percent base saturation, or the amount of calcium, magnesium, sodium, and potassium on the exchange sites as a function of all of the cations on the exchange sites. Now, you could send this to a lab and they would test both of those for you, CEC and percent base saturation. You could take an estimate. You can estimate based on texture as a means to determine cation exchange capacity. I'll show you a table in a minute. And you could use organic matter content as an estimate of cation exchange capacity. And you could do this using, let's say, a Munsell color book and estimating color. Well, you look at color and then estimate organic matter content. I like this figure here up in the top right-hand corner because this tells you, this is rough, but it tells you soil pH as a function of the percent base saturation, or the amount of calcium, magnesium, sodium, and potassium on exchange sites. And so if you're at a pH of 5.5, your base saturation is roughly 50%. And if you want to raise the base saturation to 6.5, I'm sorry, you want to raise the pH to 6.5, the base saturation is roughly about 70, maybe 70%, 75%. You could use a table like you see here that sort of estimates this curve in this figure, right? But this figure tells you quite a bit. It tells you that perhaps the target base saturation, roughly speaking, for the soils that we deal with when we lime soils is roughly around 75%, give or take. Depends on the final pH value that you want to target. You can actually look up tables like what you see here. All right, so this table tells you a lime requirement in pounds per acre to target a final pH of 6.5, given the current soil pH values ranging from 4.5 to 6, and the soil texture. Is it coarse or is it fine? And how much organic matter is present? Is the soil light colored or dark colored? And this is a rough estimate, but a means by which you can determine a lime requirement. And all these values here in this table are in pounds per acre. Okay, so if you had a current pH of 5 and you wanted to change the pH to 6.5, and you had a silt loam soil that had 1% organic matter, you would add 5,000 pounds per acre of lime. So that's simple. So let's do this. Let's look at this this question here. How much lime, and let's just say calcium carbonate, is needed to increase the pH from 5.5 to 6.5. Right, so we're going from these two dashed lines, from 5.5 initially to 6.5, and we're changing the base saturation from 50 to 75%. This soil has a cation exchange capacity of 20, and the units are mill equivalents per 100 grams. We're going to talk about this in more detail in Unit 4. And it has organic matter content of 1%. We assume this relationship here. This relationship doesn't tell you anything about how much lime to add, but you can figure it out. You can get close. Let me show you how. You can use tables like this. The bottom table is exactly what I just showed you on the previous slide. And I'm going to share with you this table in Unit 4 that tells you, it tells you soil textural class as a function of cation exchange capacity, roughly speaking. Okay, and so you can take this CEC of 20, which probably tells you that this is a clay or a clay loam, and you know the current pH value is 5.5, So if you go to this table here, 5.5, and the soil has an organic matter content of 1%, that was stated above. So you're in this top portion of this table. And the soil is a clay or a clay loam, so it's heavy. And the current pH is 5.5. We're probably down here in this table. And so you need to add about 5,000 pounds of calcium carbonate per acre to raise the pH of this particular soil from 5.5 to 6.5. It's that relatively simple. Now we're going to make it a little more complex in some of the subsequent videos for this unit.